It was the monsoon season in the Indian jungle. The forest had turned emerald green and lush, with dense bamboo thickets scattered across the undergrowth. In the middle of a small clearing where there was nowhere to hide, 8 dholes were forming a circle. At the center crouched a baby tiger, no more than 3 months old, spinning in place and crying desperately. It was calling for its mother, but nowhere in the jungle could the mother be seen, and only the baby tiger's cries echoed through the canopy. The alpha female with rust-colored fur and battle scars across her muzzle lunged forward. Sharp teeth flashed toward the baby tiger's hind legs and the cub quickly scrambled backward. But behind it, another dhole was already waiting. The moment the cub stumbled, that dhole snapped at its small striped tail. It was the dhole's classic hunting method. First exhaust the prey, then attack from all sides simultaneously. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comment where you're watching from. Hi, subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy the story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. At that very moment, Ranger Rajesh Kumar's jeep burst through the bamboo. The instant he witnessed this scene, he floored the gas pedal without hesitation. The jeep charged toward the clearing, snapping thick branches as it went. Rajesh leaped out before the vehicle had fully stopped, grabbed his rifle, and fired into the air. The gunshot tore through the jungle. The dholes flinched, but they weren't a pack that would give up easily. They retreated about 15 meters and began their staccato cackling among themselves as if conferring. Rajesh pulled out his flare gun and aimed precisely at the alpha female's feet. The red flare exploded with a deafening roar. Only then did the pack waver. The dholes scattered like rust-colored smoke, breaking formation and retreating into the bamboo thicket with their distinctive high-pitched calls echoing through the forest. But Rajesh knew better than to trust their retreat. Dholes didn't give up on a kill easily. They were among the most persistent predators in Asia, capable of harassing prey for hours until exhaustion claimed what teeth could not. He fired another shot into the air, the crack of the rifle sharp enough to make his ears ring. Then another. The alpha female paused at the tree line, her amber eyes fixed on Rajesh with an intelligence that made his skin prickle. She was calculating, weighing risk against reward, deciding whether this human was a temporary obstacle or a permanent threat. Rajesh grabbed 2 more flares from the jeep and fired them in rapid succession, sending bursts of red phosphorescence screaming into the undergrowth where the pack had retreated. The explosions were deafening in the confined space of the jungle, and finally, the dholes broke completely, their calls fading as they retreated deeper into the forest. But they wouldn't go far. They'd circle back, wait for the human to leave, finish what they'd started. Rajesh turned to the tiger cub. It stood in the center of the clearing, tiny and trembling, its bright orange and black stripes vivid against the green backdrop. Blood matted the fur on its tail where a dhole had bitten down, and scratches marked its flanks from near misses. Its blue-gray cub eyes were wide with terror, its small mouth open in a silent cry. 15 years of ranger training told Rajesh exactly what to do. Document the scene, call it in, let nature take its course. Non-interference was the cardinal rule of wildlife management. Humans didn't pick winners and losers in the natural world. Predation was part of the ecosystem. The strong survived. The weak died. That was how nature worked. Rajesh walked toward the cub anyway. The moment he moved, the cub's fear transformed into something more primal. It tried to run, stumbled on its injured tail, let out a shriek of pain and terror that cut through Rajesh like a blade. He could hear the dholes responding in the distance, that terrible cackling that meant they were still watching, still waiting. Easy, Rajesh said softly, knowing the cub couldn't understand his words but hoping his tone might penetrate the animal's panic. Easy, little one. I'm not going to hurt you. He pulled off his jacket as he approached, moving slowly, keeping his body low and non-threatening. The cub backed away until it hit a fallen log and could retreat no farther. It bared tiny fangs, adorable rather than threatening, and hissed with all the ferocity its 3-month-old body could muster. Rajesh threw the jacket over the cub in one smooth motion, then scooped up the bundle before the animal could react. The cub exploded into movement inside the fabric, clawing and biting at the thick canvas, screaming with rage and fear. Tiny needle-sharp claws found skin through his shirt, drawing blood. Milk teeth, not yet developed into the massive canines that would come later, still managed to find his forearm and bite down hard enough to make him gasp. He held on anyway, pressing the struggling bundle against his chest as he ran back to the jeep. Every second mattered now. The dholes would be circling closer, and an injured cub was too valuable a prize to abandon easily. Rajesh threw himself into the driver's seat, still clutching the writhing jacket-wrapped cub with one arm while fumbling for the ignition with his free hand. The engine roared to life. He slammed the jeep into reverse, branches scraping against the doors as he backed out of the clearing at dangerous speed. Only when he'd put 200 meters between himself and the attack site did he stop to assess what he'd done. The cub had gone still in his arms, exhausted from struggling or perhaps realizing the human wasn't killing it. Rajesh carefully peeled back the jacket to examine his prize, if it could be called that. The cub stared up at him with those cloudy blue eyes that would eventually turn amber. Its breathing came in rapid pants, its small ribcage heaving. The tail injury was worse than he'd thought. The dhole's teeth had torn through skin and muscle, creating a wound that would become infected without treatment. "What have I done?" Rajesh whispered to himself. He'd just violated the fundamental principle of his profession. He'd interfered in natural predation. He'd chosen one animal's life over the hunting success of 8 others. His supervisor would be furious. His colleagues would question his judgment. And for what? To save one tiger cub in a forest that had thousands? Except India didn't have thousands of tigers anymore. Barely 3,000 remained in the entire country. Every single one mattered. Every cub that survived to adulthood was a victory against extinction. But that wasn't why he'd done it. Rajesh knew that with brutal honesty as he looked down at the terrified animal in his lap. He hadn't intervened because of population statistics or conservation goals. He'd intervened because watching that cub die while he had the power to prevent it would have broken something essential inside him. The cub mewed, a soft, desperate sound that tigers made when calling for their mothers. The sound that had been echoing through the clearing while the dholes circled. "Where is she?" Rajesh asked the cub, as if it could answer. "Where's your mother?" Tiger cubs this young didn't stray far from their mothers. They couldn't hunt, couldn't defend themselves. A tigress would never willingly leave her cub vulnerable to predator attack. Which meant either the mother was dead, or something had happened to prevent her from protecting her offspring. Rajesh looked back toward the clearing, now hidden by dense bamboo and undergrowth. Protocol said to return to the ranger station immediately, treat the cub's injuries, file his report. But if the mother was alive and injured somewhere nearby, she'd be looking for her cub. She'd be desperate, dangerous, likely to attack anything she perceived as a threat, including a human who'd taken her baby. The cub mewed again, and Rajesh made his second protocol-breaking decision of the day. He was going back to look for the mother. Rajesh secured the cub in a transport crate he kept for small animal rescues, designed for civets and jungle cats, barely large enough for a tiger cub but it would have to do. The cub's protests filled the jeep, high-pitched wails that would carry through the forest like a beacon. Like a signal to anything listening. He grabbed his rifle and a medical kit, locked the jeep, and began his search in widening circles from the clearing. Tiger mothers with young cubs typically stayed within a territory of just a few square kilometers, moving between den sites but never straying far from their offspring. If she was alive, she'd be close. The jungle fought him with every step. Thorny vines caught at his uniform. Bamboo thickets grew so dense he had to force his way through, the hollow stems cracking like gunshots. His boots sank into mud still soft from the monsoon rains. Sweat poured down his face despite the canopy shade. And everywhere, he listened for the sounds that didn't belong. The alarm calls of langur monkeys spotting a predator, the warning barks of somber deer, the sudden silence that meant something dangerous was near. He heard nothing but his own passage through the undergrowth and the distant calls of birds. 30 meters from the clearing, Rajesh found the blood. It painted the leaves of a low fern in rust-brown streaks, already drying in the humid air. Not the small amount from the cub's injured tail. This was substantial, the kind of blood loss that spoke of serious trauma. He followed the trail deeper into the bamboo thicket, his rifle ready, his heart hammering. Every ranger knew the statistics. Tigers killed more people in India than any other large predator. An injured tiger, cornered and desperate, was exponentially more dangerous. And if this tiger had just watched humans take her cub, she'd be beyond desperate. The blood trail led to a dense tangle of undergrowth beneath a massive banyan tree, its aerial roots creating a natural fortress of shadow and concealment. Rajesh stopped 10 meters away, scanning for movement, for the telltale shape of striped fur against green foliage. "Nothing. I know you're there," he said quietly. His voice steady despite the fear crawling up his spine. I have your cub. It's safe. But I need to see you. Silence. Then, so faint he almost missed it, a sound that made his blood run cold. A low, rumbling growl. Not aggressive. Not threatening. Pain. Rajesh circled slowly to the right, changing his angle of approach, and that's when he saw her. The tigress lay on her side in the shadows, her massive body partially hidden by the banyan's roots. She was young, maybe 4 years old, not much more than a large cub herself. Her coat was matted with blood and mud, her breathing labored and shallow. But her eyes were open, fixed on Rajesh with an intensity that froze him in place. He'd seen wounded animals before, had witnessed their fear, their aggression, their desperation to escape. But what he saw in this tigress's eyes was something different. Recognition, awareness, and terrible, helpless understanding. "Oh God," Rajesh whispered. He moved closer, slowly, reading the signs his ranger training had taught him. The blood came from her right shoulder and upper back. Deep gashes that looked like they'd been made by another tiger's claws. Territorial dispute, probably. A larger male had driven her off, had injured her badly enough that she couldn't stand. How long had she been here? A day? 2? Long enough that the Doles had detected her weakness. Long enough that they'd tracked her scent to find her cub. Long enough that she'd heard her baby's cries and been unable to respond. Rajesh's eyes stung. He blinked hard, forcing himself to remain professional, to assess the situation clinically. The tigress hadn't fled when he approached. Hadn't tried to attack despite a human being well within her striking range. She simply lay there, watching him with those amber eyes that held more intelligence than he'd ever credited a wild animal with possessing. She'd been here. The whole time. Had heard the Doles circling. Had heard her cub's terrified cries. Had heard the gunshots and engine and human voices. She'd witnessed everything and been powerless to intervene. "You couldn't save your baby," Rajesh said softly, his voice breaking. "So you let me do it." The tigress's ear twitched, the only movement she seemed capable of making. Her breath came in rapid, shallow pants. The shoulder wound had stopped bleeding, but the amount of blood soaking the ground beneath her spoke of catastrophic blood loss. Without treatment, infection would set in within hours. She would die here, alone in the shadows, while her cub cried for her from inside a metal cage. Rajesh pulled out his radio, his hands shaking as he keyed the transmit button. "Base, this is Kumar. I need immediate veterinary support and a large animal transport. I've got an injured adult tigress, approximately 120 kilos, severe lacerations, possible shock. And..." He paused, knowing what this next part would mean. "I've also got her cub in custody. Request permission to transport both animals to the rescue center." The silence on the other end lasted 5 seconds that felt like 5 hours. Then his supervisor's voice crackled through, tight with controlled anger. "Kumar, are you telling me you interfered with a predation event?" Rajesh looked at the tigress, at the way her body trembled with exhaustion and pain, at the dried blood on her muzzle where she'd probably licked her wounds and tried to will her body to heal faster. "Yes, sir," he said. "That's exactly what I'm telling you. You've violated every protocol we have. Do you understand what you've done? I saved a life, sir. 2 lives. Possibly the only lives that mattered." Another silence. Then, "We'll discuss your employment status when you return. The vet team is on the way. Don't do anything else stupid." The radio went dead. Rajesh clipped it back to his belt and looked at the tigress. "Help is coming," he told her. "I promise. Your cub is safe, and help is coming for you." The tigress's eyes held his for one more long moment. Then, as if she'd been waiting for exactly those words, her eyes drifted closed and her body went limp. Rajesh's heart lurched. He moved forward quickly, pressing his fingers against her neck, searching for a pulse. Still there. Weak but there. She hadn't died. She'd surrendered to unconsciousness now that she knew her cub was safe. Now that she could finally stop fighting to stay alert and let her body focus on survival instead of vigilance. She'd been holding on for her baby. And now that she knew someone was protecting her cub, she could let go. Rajesh sank to his knees in the mud beside her, his rifle forgotten, and let the tears come. The veterinary team arrived 40 minutes later. Dr. Priya Sharma and 2 assistants loaded with equipment that seemed woefully inadequate for the task ahead. Priya took one look at the unconscious tigress and let out a low whistle. She's barely holding on, Priya said, kneeling beside the tigress and checking her vitals. Pulse is weak. Respiration shallow. These wounds are at least 2 days old. Infection is setting in. She looked up at Rajesh. You understand what you're asking me to do? Moving an animal in this condition could kill her. The stress alone. Leaving her here will definitely kill her, Rajesh interrupted. At least this way she has a chance. Priya studied him for a moment, then nodded. All right. But we do this my way. Sedation first, full medical assessment, then we decide if transport is even possible. She prepared a syringe with practiced efficiency, calculating the dosage based on the tigress's estimated weight. The injection went into the shoulder muscle, the one part of the tigress that wasn't covered in wounds. They waited in tense silence for the sedative to take full effect, watching the rise and fall of the tigress's ribcage, waiting for the moment when even that unconsciousness deepened into chemical sleep. Okay, Priya said finally. Let's get her on the stretcher. Carefully. Support the injured shoulder. If we tear those wounds open further, she's done. It took all 4 of them to lift the tigress onto the canvas stretcher, and even unconscious she was a terrifying weight of muscle and predatory power. Rajesh found himself holding her massive head, feeling the heat of her breath against his hands, aware that these jaws could crush his skull with a single bite even if she were sedated. They were halfway to the jeep when Rajesh's radio crackled to life. Kumar, this is Director Mehta. I'm en route to your location. Do not move those animals until I arrive. That's an order. Rajesh and Priya exchanged glances. How far out is he? Priya asked quietly. 20 minutes, maybe 30 given the terrain. The tigress doesn't have 30 minutes. Look at her gums, they're pale. She's going into shock. We need to get her to the clinic now, or we're going to lose her in the field. Rajesh made his decision. Keep moving. They loaded the tigress into the back of the veterinary transport vehicle, a modified truck with a reinforced cargo area designed for exactly this kind of emergency. The cub, still crying in its crate, went in beside its mother. The moment the crate was in place, the cub's cries transformed into something different. Not terror anymore, but recognition. It pressed against the bars, trying to reach the unconscious tigress. They need to be separated, one of Priya's assistants said. If she wakes up. She won't wake up for hours, Priya said, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely certain. Let's move. They were 10 minutes down the rough forest road when Director Mehta's vehicle intercepted them, forcing Priya to slam on the brakes. Mehta stepped out, his face red with fury, his uniform crisp despite the jungle heat. I gave you a direct order, Kumar. The animal was dying, sir. We didn't have time. You didn't have authority. Mehta's voice rose to a shout. Do you have any idea what you've done? You've interfered in natural predation. You've removed 2 apex predators from their territory during a critical period. You've set a precedent that could undermine decades of conservation policy. I saved their lives, Rajesh said quietly. Nature doesn't need you to save lives. Nature needs you to document, to observe, to protect habitat and manage human-wildlife conflict. Not to play God deciding which animals live and which die. Mehta took a breath, visibly trying to control his anger. Those dolls need to eat too, Kumar. They have pups back in their den. You've taken their meal, prolonged their hunger, possibly condemned their offspring to starvation. Did you think about that? I thought about a baby tiger crying for its mother, Rajesh said, his voice hardening. I thought about a tigress forced to watch her cub being hunted while she was too injured to move. I thought about the fact that we have fewer than 3,000 tigers left in this country, and every single one matters. Individual animals don't matter in conservation. Mehta snapped. Populations matter. Ecosystems matter. The individual is irrelevant. Then maybe I'm in the wrong profession. The words hung in the humid air between them. Mehta's expression shifted from anger to something colder. Perhaps you are. When we return to headquarters, you'll submit your resignation. Effective immediately. From the back of the truck came a sound that made everyone freeze, a low rumbling growl that vibrated through the metal walls. The tigress was waking up. She can't be waking up already, Priya said, her face going pale. The sedative should keep her under for at least 3 hours. The growl intensified. The entire truck rocked as something massive shifted inside. Drive! Rajesh shouted. Drive now! Priya didn't argue. She jumped back into the driver's seat and floored the accelerator, leaving Meta standing in the road behind them. The truck bounced violently over the rough terrain, and each impact brought another ominous sound from the cargo area. The scrape of claws on metal, the thump of a heavy body moving, the terrible growl of a predator regaining consciousness in a confined space. She's fighting the sedative, Priya said, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. The stress and pain are counteracting it. If she fully wakes before we reach the clinic. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Everyone in the vehicle understood exactly what would happen if a fully conscious, terrified, injured tigress found herself caged with humans. The cub's cries had turned frantic, as if it sensed its mother's distress. Through the reinforced partition separating the cab from the cargo area, Rajesh could hear the tigress's breathing. Harsh, rapid, the sound of an animal clawing its way back to awareness. How much farther? He asked. 8 kilometers. Maybe 10 minutes at this speed. 10 minutes. The tigress just needed to stay sedated for 10 more minutes. The growling stopped. In the sudden silence, Rajesh heard something worse. The sound of the tigress moving deliberately, testing her confinement, searching for a way out. She's fully awake, Priya whispered. The first impact against the partition made everyone jump. The reinforced metal dented inward with a shriek of tortured steel. 300 pounds of terrified apex predator, trapped and injured and desperate. Rajesh pulled his rifle closer, knowing it would be useless at this range, knowing that if the tigress breached the partition they were all dead. The second impact was harder. The metal groaned. 5 more minutes, Priya said, her voice steady despite the terror in her eyes. Just 5 more minutes. Come on, girl. Hold on. We're trying to help you. The tigress hit the partition a third time, and this time something gave. A weld, a bolt, something structural that had been holding the barrier in place. Through the gap, Rajesh could see an amber eye, wild with pain and fear, searching the cab. Searching for her cub. Give her the cub, Rajesh said suddenly. What? Open the crate. Let the cub go to her. She's not trying to escape. She's trying to reach her baby. That's insane. She could kill it in her current state. Do it. They made it to the rescue center with the partition holding by 3 bolts and a prayer. The moment Priya had opened the cub's crate, the tiny tiger had scrambled through the gap in the partition and pressed itself against its mother's blood-matted fur. The tigress's aggression had evaporated instantly, replaced by the gentle rumble of a mother reassuring her offspring. She'd stopped fighting the transport, stopped trying to escape, and had simply curled her massive body around the cub for the remaining kilometers. Now, under the harsh fluorescent lights of the surgical suite, the true extent of her injuries became horrifyingly clear. 3 deep lacerations across the right shoulder, Priya said, her voice clinical as she examined the wounds. The deepest one has severed the trapezius muscle completely. There's significant damage to the rhomboid as well. She wouldn't have been able to lift this leg at all. Rajesh stood across the table, his hands gloved and ready to assist. The tigress lay unconscious again, this time properly sedated with the full dosage Priya had administered the moment they'd gotten her onto the examination table. The cub was in a recovery crate nearby, its tail wound cleaned and bandaged, already sleeping off its own mild sedative. Can you repair it? Rajesh asked. Priya didn't answer immediately. She probed the wound carefully, assessing muscle damage, checking for signs of infection in the tissue. The muscle hasn't necrotized yet, that's good. But this happened at least 48 hours ago. Infection is already establishing. I'm going to have to debride a significant amount of tissue before I can even think about suturing. She began to work, her movements precise despite the late hour. It was past midnight now. They'd been at this for 3 hours already. Stabilizing the tigress, running blood work, setting up 4 lines to combat dehydration and deliver antibiotics. Scalpel, Priya said, and Rajesh placed the instrument in her waiting hand. The debridement was brutal to watch. Priya cut away infected tissue with ruthless efficiency, dropping the pieces into a surgical pan. Each cut revealed more damage, more evidence of how close the tigress had come to death. Another day without treatment and the infection would have gone septic. Another 2 days and she would have died alone in the jungle while her cub starved. There, Priya said finally, sitting back. That's all the compromised tissue. Now we see if I can put her back together. The actual repair took 2 more hours. Priya worked with the intense focus of someone performing surgery on a creature that shouldn't have to fight this hard for survival. India's national animal, reduced to fewer than 3,000 individuals, each one precious beyond measure. But it wasn't the conservation status that made Rajesh's hands shake as he held retractors and passed instruments. It was the memory of those amber eyes watching him from the shadows. The terrible understanding he'd seen there. The impossible choice the tigress had made. To trust a human with her most precious thing because she had no other option. The muscles responding well to the sutures, Priya murmured, her needle moving with practiced precision through tissue. She's young. Healthy despite the injury. If we can keep the infection under control, she should regain full mobility in the shoulder. And if we can't? Then she'll never hunt successfully again. A tiger that can't use its right foreleg can't bring down prey. She'd starve, or she'd turn to easier targets. Livestock. Maybe even humans. Priya glanced up at him. Is that what you want to release back into the park? A man-eater in the making? That's not going to happen. You can't know that. I know, Rajesh said quietly, that she deserves the chance to try. Priya held his gaze for a moment, then returned to her work. You're going to lose your job over this. Probably. Was it worth it? Rajesh looked at the tigress on the table, her massive paws that could kill with a single swipe now limp and vulnerable, her striped coat matted with blood and antiseptic, her breathing steady and deep under anesthesia. In the crate behind them, her cub shifted and mewed softly in its sleep. Ask me again in 6 weeks, he said. The final suture went in at 3:47 a.m. Priya tied it off with a satisfied nod and stepped back to examine her work. The shoulder wound was closed, drainage tubes in place, the entire area wrapped in sterile bandaging that would need to be changed daily. She'll be in significant pain when she wakes, Priya said, stripping off her surgical gloves. We'll keep her sedated for the first 48 hours. Let the initial healing begin before we allow her to regain full consciousness. The cub can stay with her. Actually, that's probably better. It'll keep her calmer when she does wake. They moved the tigress to a large recovery enclosure. More cage than room, but spacious enough for her to move when she was ready. The cub was placed beside her, and immediately the tiny tiger pressed against its mother's side, purring with the distinctive chuff sound that tigers used for comfort. Rajesh watched through the observation window as mother and cub lay together under the dim recovery lights. The tigress's chest rose and fell with mechanical regularity, kept alive by human medicine and human intervention in the natural order that Director Mehta insisted should be left undisturbed. You know what the worst part is? Priya said, appearing beside him with 2 cups of tea. He's not entirely wrong. Rajesh took the offered cup but said nothing. We can't save them all, Priya continued. Every rupee we spend on this tigress, every hour of my time, every dose of antibiotic, that's resources taken from other animals, other conservation efforts. There are orphaned elephant calves that need feeding. Leopards caught in snares. Sloth bears poisoned by farmers. We have to make choices about where to allocate limited resources. So you're saying I made the wrong choice? I'm saying there's no right choice. Just the one you can live with. She sipped her tea, her eyes on the sleeping tigers. But for what it's worth? If I'd been the one who found them, I'd have done the same thing. They stood in silence for a long moment, 2 exhausted people watching over India's most iconic predator while it healed from wounds inflicted by its own kind. She was watching, Rajesh said suddenly. When the dholes attacked her cub. She was there the whole time, too injured to move, forced to watch while they circled for the kill. Priya's expression shifted. You're certain? The wounds are 2 days old. But she was lactating recently, showing signs of acute stress. She didn't abandon that cub. She couldn't protect it. Jesus, Priya whispered. That means she made a choice. When you showed up, when you took her cub, she could have tried to attack you despite her injuries. Could have called out, warned you off. But she stayed hidden. She let me take her baby because she knew it was the only chance for survival. They both looked at the tigress with new understanding. This wasn't just an injured animal they'd rescued. This was a mother who had made an impossible sacrifice, who had weighed her options in whatever way tigers calculated such things and had chosen to trust the mercy of a species that had hunted hers to near extinction. We can't fail her, Rajesh said. Whatever it costs, whatever it takes, we have to get her back to the wild healthy enough to protect her cub. Priya nodded slowly. Then you'd better hope 6 weeks is enough. The tigress woke on the third day with a roar that shook the walls of the recovery center and sent every staff member running to check the enclosure's reinforced locks. She was a different animal from the broken, bleeding creature they'd found in the jungle. Pain and confusion had transformed into fury. At the cage, at her wounds, at the humans who had dared to confine an apex predator. She threw herself against the bars with such force that Priya ordered everyone to stay back, to give the tigress space to exhaust her rage without feeling cornered. The only one who could calm her was the cub. When the tiny tiger mewed and pressed against its mother's side, the tigress would stop her assault on the cage and curl protectively around her offspring, her rumbling growl shifting from aggression to reassurance. "She's going to hurt herself," one of the younger staff members said, watching the tigress pace the perimeter of the enclosure with awkward, limping steps. "Should we sedate her again?" "No," Priya said firmly. "She needs to move. The shoulder won't heal properly if we keep her immobilized. Let her work through this." Rajesh found himself spending hours at the observation window, watching the tigress adapt to her temporary prison. She tested every bar, every weld, searching for weakness. She refused to eat for the first 4 days, eyeing the meat offerings with suspicion, convinced they were poisoned or drugged. It was the cub that changed things. On the 5th day, hunger overcame the tiny tiger's caution and it began eating the raw chicken pieces Rajesh slid through the feeding slot. The tigress watched her cub eat, watched it survive, and only then did she approach the food herself. "She's testing it through her cub," Rajesh observed. "Making sure it's safe before she'll touch it." "Tigers are smarter than people give them credit for," Priya said. "Especially mothers. They calculate risk constantly." By the 2nd week, the tigress's wound was healing ahead of schedule. The infection had been conquered by aggressive antibiotic treatment, the sutures were holding, and she was beginning to bear weight on the injured leg. She still limped badly, still favored the left side, but improvement was visible day by day. And something else was changing too. Something Rajesh wasn't supposed to notice, wasn't supposed to acknowledge, but couldn't ignore. The tigress was watching him. Not with the aggressive stare of a predator assessing prey, but with something more complex. When Rajesh brought food, she no longer retreated to the far corner of the enclosure. She'd stay where she was, her amber eyes tracking his movements with what might have been recognition. The cub had already decided Rajesh was safe. It would approach the bars when he arrived, chuffing the greeting sound tigers used with family members. Sometimes it would bat at his fingers through the bars with paws that would one day be deadly weapons but were now just adorable. "You're not supposed to bond with them," Priya warned him during the 3rd week. "The whole point is to minimize human contact so they can be released back to the wild." "I'm just feeding them. You're talking to them. I've heard you. You're narrating what you're doing, explaining the treatment plan like they can understand." Rajesh didn't deny it. "Does it matter if they understand? I'm not trying to tame them." "No, but you're getting attached. That's dangerous for you and for them." She was right. Rajesh knew she was right. But every time he looked at the tigress and remembered those moments in the jungle, her watching helplessly as her cub was hunted, her impossible choice to trust a human with her most precious thing, he couldn't maintain professional distance. This wasn't just another tiger. This was the tiger who had rewritten his understanding of what wild animals were capable of feeling, thinking, choosing. During the 4th week, Priya made her discovery. She was examining the tigress's medical records when she noticed the timeline discrepancy. The age of the wounds versus the evidence of recent acute stress. "Rajesh, look at this." She pulled up the initial examination photos. "These injuries are at least 48 hours old when we found her. But look at the cortisol levels in her first blood draw. They're through the roof. That's not pain stress. That's psychological trauma." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying she witnessed the attack on her cub. She was conscious, aware, probably within sight of the clearing. And she was too injured to intervene." Priya's voice dropped. "Do you understand what that means? She wasn't just protecting her cub from us. She was making a calculated decision to let you take her baby because she knew she couldn't save it herself." The implications hit Rajesh like a physical blow. The tigress hadn't just been injured. She'd been forced to watch her cub being hunted to death. Had heard every cry, every terrified mew. Had experienced the particular hell of maternal helplessness. And when Rajesh had appeared, when he'd scattered the doles and picked up the cub, she could have attacked despite her injuries. Could have tried to defend her offspring from this new threat. Instead, she'd stayed hidden. Had allowed a human to take her cub. Had trusted that he would protect what she could not. How much does a tiger understand about human behavior? Rajesh asked quietly. We don't know. Traditional wisdom says they're pure instinct, no higher reasoning. But Priya gestured at the enclosure where the tigress lay watching them through the observation window. Look at her. Really look at her. Rajesh did. The tigress's eyes met his across the distance, and he saw intelligence there that couldn't be explained away as anthropomorphic projection. By the 6th week, the tigress was bearing full weight on the injured shoulder. She could run, awkwardly at first, then with increasing grace. She could rear up on her hind legs, could swipe with both front paws. All the movements she'd need to hunt successfully in the wild. The cub had grown visibly, gaining weight and confidence, its play fighting with its mother growing more serious as it practiced the skills it would need to survive. They're ready, Priya announced during the final examination. Medically speaking, there's no reason to keep them here longer. But Rajesh found himself hesitating. Out there, the dholes were still hunting. The larger male tiger who'd injured the tigress still controlled the best territory. The forest was no safer now than it had been 6 weeks ago. She survived out there before, Priya said gently, reading his thoughts. She'll survive again. That's what wild animals do. What if she can't protect her cub? What if? Then nature takes its course. That's what Meta would say anyway. Meta's not here. No, but he'll be at the release. He insisted on it. Said he wants to document your misguided intervention for the official record. Priya's expression was sympathetic. This is really happening, Rajesh. You're losing your job over this. Rajesh looked at the tigress, at the way she groomed her cub with rough strokes of her massive tongue, at the healed scar on her shoulder that would mark her for life. I know, he said. And I'd do it again. The release site was less than 2 kilometers from where Rajesh had found the tigress, close enough to her original territory that she'd recognize the landmarks, but far enough from the larger male's core range that she could reclaim her space without immediate confrontation. Director Mehta stood beside the transport cage with a camera crew documenting everything. He'd made it clear this wasn't a celebration. It was evidence. Evidence of protocol violations, of misguided sentimentality, of a ranger who'd forgotten that conservation was about ecosystems, not individuals. Rajesh stood on the opposite side of the clearing, trying to ignore Mehta's presence, trying to focus on what mattered. The tigress paced inside the reinforced cage, her shoulder healed, her body strong, her cub pressed against her side. 6 weeks of captivity ending with a single open door. Are you ready? Priya asked quietly. Rajesh wasn't sure he'd ever be ready. Ready to let go of the animal he'd spent 6 weeks caring for, watching heal, growing attached to despite every professional instinct telling him not to. Ready to watch her walk back into a forest that had nearly killed her once and could easily try again. But that was the point, wasn't it? The wild wasn't meant to be safe. It was meant to be wild. Open it, he said. Priya moved to the cage's release mechanism. A simple lever that would lift the front gate and give the tigress her freedom. She pulled it, and the gate rose with a metallic groan. For a long moment, nothing happened. The tigress stood at the threshold, her massive frame blocking the opening, her cub hidden behind her. She could smell the forest, could hear the familiar sounds of her territory, could feel the call of the wild that no amount of human care could replace. But she didn't move. Come on, girl, Rajesh whispered. Go. You're free. The tigress turned her head, and her amber eyes found Rajesh across the clearing. The look that passed between them made his breath catch. Not aggression, not fear, but recognition so profound it seemed to transcend the boundaries of species. She'd been here before. 6 weeks ago, injured and helpless. And she'd watched him take her cub, had made an impossible choice to trust him. Now the choice was hers again. Stay in the safety of captivity, or return to the brutal uncertainty of the jungle. The tigress made her decision. She stepped out of the cage. But instead of bolting for the tree line, instead of putting as much distance as possible between herself and the humans who had confined her, she did something that would be debated by wildlife behaviorists for years to come. She walked directly toward Rajesh. Don't move, Mehta hissed, his hand moving toward the tranquilizer rifle. Kumar, stay absolutely still. But Rajesh wasn't afraid. He stood his ground as 300 pounds of apex predator closed the distance between them, as massive paws that could disembowel with a single swipe carried her closer with each deliberate step. The tigress stopped less than a meter away. Up close, she was enormous. Her shoulders at Rajesh's chest height, her head massive and powerful, her teeth visible when she breathed. One lunge, one bite, and he would be dead before anyone could intervene. The cameras were rolling. Meta was shouting something. Priya had her hand on a tranquilizer gun. None of it mattered. The tigress looked at Rajesh for one more long moment. Then, with impossible gentleness, she lowered her massive head and pressed her forehead against his chest. The gesture lasted perhaps 5 seconds. Firm, deliberate, unmistakable. Not aggression. Not accident. Communication in the only language that transcended species. Physical touch that conveyed what words could not. Thank you. I understand what you did. I remember. Rajesh's hand moved without conscious thought, coming to rest on the tigress's head between her ears. He felt the heat of her body, the texture of her fur, the solid reality of a wild predator choosing connection over instinct. You're welcome, he whispered. The tigress stepped back. She turned to her cub, chuffed once, the signal to follow, and began walking toward the tree line. The cub hesitated at the cage entrance, looking between its mother and Rajesh. Then it mewed once, a sound that might have been goodbye, and bounded after the tigress. They disappeared into the bamboo thicket, orange stripes melting into green shadows, until Rajesh couldn't tell where the tigers ended and the jungle began. The clearing fell silent except for the whir of cameras and Meta's stunned breathing. Did that just? One of the camera operators began. Yes, Priya said quietly. Yes, it did. Meta stood frozen, his prepared speech about protocol violations dying on his lips. He'd come to document failure, to prove that human intervention in natural processes was misguided and dangerous. Instead, he'd witnessed something that challenged every assumption about the emotional capacity of wild animals. Something that suggested the boundary between human and wild wasn't as absolute as science had insisted. The footage, Meta said finally, his voice strange. No one outside this team sees it. Not until I've decided how to contextualize. No, Rajesh interrupted. He walked toward Meta, his legs somehow steady despite the adrenaline crash hitting his system. You don't get to bury this. You don't get to pretend it didn't happen because it doesn't fit your narrative. That tigress could have killed you. What we just saw, it's an anomaly. It doesn't prove. It proves that we don't understand them as well as we think we do. It proves that maybe sometimes, compassion is exactly what conservation needs. Rajesh's voice was firm. You wanted documentation? You got it. What happens with it now is up to you. Meta stared at him for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, his shoulders sagged. I was wrong about you, Kumar. I thought you were just another sentimental ranger who couldn't handle the harsh realities of wildlife management. He paused. But maybe I'm the one who's been too harsh. Too willing to see animals as data points instead of whatever that was. Does that mean I still have a job? Meta smiled thinly. You're on probation for 6 months. One more protocol violation and you're done. But... He looked toward the tree line where the tigers had vanished. I want you to lead our new rehabilitation program. Expand it beyond what we've been doing. If we're going to intervene in cases like this, we need proper procedures, medical protocols, release criteria. Rajesh felt something loosen in his chest, tension he'd been carrying for 6 weeks finally releasing. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet. You're going to have to write the manual on this. Every decision you made, every treatment protocol, every assessment criteria. Document it all so the next ranger who finds an injured tiger knows exactly what to do. I can do that. Meta nodded, then turned to his camera crew. Pack it up. And yes, Kumar, the footage stays. All of it. The world deserves to see what happened here today. As the crew began loading equipment, Priya appeared at Rajesh's side. So, was it worth it? Rajesh looked at the forest where the tigress and her cub had disappeared. Somewhere in those green shadows, a mother was teaching her baby to hunt, to survive, to thrive in a world that wanted them extinct. Ask me again in a year, he said. When we see if she successfully raises that cub to independence. When we know if the shoulder holds up to the stress of hunting. When we find out if she can reclaim her territory and defend it. And if she can't? If we check the camera traps next month and find she's been killed by that larger male? If the cub starves because she can't hunt effectively, then at least we tried. At least we gave them a chance they wouldn't have had otherwise. Rajesh smiled. But I don't think that's going to happen. I think she's going to surprise us. Why? Because she survived this long with an injury that should have killed her. Because she made an impossible choice to save her cub. Because she just did something no wild tiger should be capable of. She expressed gratitude to a human who had caged her. Rajesh started walking toward his jeep, ready to head back to the ranger station and begin the mountain of paperwork that awaited him. She's a survivor, Priya. And survivors find a way. Rajesh returned to the release site 3 months later, alone. It was early morning, the jungle still wrapped in mist, the canopy alive with the calls of langurs announcing the dawn. He'd checked the camera traps the day before, images of the tigress moving through her territory with fluid grace, the shoulder showing no sign of impairment. Images of the cub, nearly twice the size it had been at release, playing and hunting insects while its mother watched with patient tolerance. They were thriving. Against the odds, against Meta's predictions, against every statistical probability, they were surviving in the wild. But Rajesh had needed to see the place again. To stand in the clearing where everything had changed, where a wild predator had chosen connection over instinct, where the rigid boundaries he'd maintained between human and animal had dissolved in a gesture that lasted 5 seconds but would define the rest of his career. 15 years he'd worked in wildlife conservation. 15 years of documenting, observing, protecting habitat and managing human-wildlife conflict. He'd seen hundreds of tigers through spotting scopes and camera traps, had tracked their movements through territories, had analyzed their scat and studied their kill sites. But he'd never truly seen them until that moment in the jungle when he'd locked eyes with an injured tigress and understood that something was looking back at him. Not just biological programming, not just survival instinct, but awareness. Choice. Intelligence that operated on frequencies science hadn't yet learned to measure. The rehabilitation program he'd been asked to develop was already changing how the park handled wildlife emergencies. 2 leopards, a sloth bear, and another tiger, a young male caught in a poacher's snare, had been brought to the rescue center in the past 3 months. Each one treated, rehabilitated, and released back to the wild with comprehensive monitoring protocols. But none of them had affected him the way the tigress had. None of them had made him question everything he thought he understood about the emotional lives of wild animals. A sound in the undergrowth made Rajesh turn. For a moment, he saw nothing but green shadows and bamboo. Then the stripes materialized, orange and black moving through dappled sunlight with the fluid grace of a healthy apex predator. The tigress stepped into the clearing. Rajesh's breath caught. She shouldn't be here. Camera trap data showed her territory core was 3 kilometers northeast. She had no reason to be in this particular clearing on this particular morning. Unless she'd known he would be here. The thought was absurd. Anthropomorphic projection of the worst kind. Tigers didn't track humans for social reasons. They avoided human contact whenever possible. But the tigress was walking toward him. She stopped at the same distance she'd stopped before. Close enough that Rajesh could see the healed scar on her shoulder, could count her whiskers, could smell the musk of wild predator. Her amber eyes held his with that same unsettling intelligence that suggested he was being seen, not just observed. Behind her, the cub emerged from the bamboo. It was huge now, nearly 2/3 its mother's size, losing the baby features that had made it adorable and gaining the powerful musculature that would make it deadly. The cub chuffed once, the greeting sound Rajesh recognized from their weeks in the recovery center. It started toward him, curiosity overriding caution. The tigress's low rumble stopped the cub instantly. Stay back. He's not prey, but he's not pack either. Mother and cub stood together at the edge of the clearing, and Rajesh understood what he was witnessing. The tigress had brought her cub here deliberately. Had shown her offspring the human who had intervened when nature had failed them. Teaching through example that not all humans were threats, that sometimes, in rare precious moments, compassion existed across the species barrier. Or maybe he was reading too much into it. Maybe this was just coincidence. Just a tigress taking her cub through her territory and happening across a human who smelled familiar. But Rajesh didn't think so. The tigress held his gaze for one more long moment. Then she turned and disappeared back into the jungle, her cub bounding after her, and within seconds it was as if they'd never been there at all. Rajesh stood alone in the clearing, listening to the forest resume its normal rhythms around him. Somewhere above, a hornbill called. Somewhere distant, a somber deer barked an alarm. The jungle continued its eternal cycle of life and death, predation and survival, exactly as it had for thousands of years before humans tried to manage it. But something had shifted. Some fundamental understanding about what conservation meant, about what it was trying to protect. Meta had been right that populations mattered, that ecosystems required balance, that individual animals were statistically irrelevant in the grand scheme of species survival. But Meta had also been wrong. Because that individual tigress, that single mother who'd made an impossible choice to trust a human, had changed everything. She'd proven that compassion wasn't weakness, that intervention could succeed, that sometimes the most natural thing was to refuse to let nature take its course. She'd also proven something more profound. That wild animals weren't the simple creatures science had insisted they were. They made choices. They remembered. They experienced emotions that looked suspiciously like gratitude when viewed through the lens of cross-species interaction. Science would eventually catch up. Researchers would study animal cognition and emotional intelligence and discover what Rajesh already knew: that the boundary between human and animal was far more permeable than anyone wanted to admit. But for now, the forest kept its secrets. And Rajesh was content to be one of the few humans privileged enough to glimpse them. He walked back to his jeep as the sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist. Tomorrow he'd be back at the ranger station, training new recruits in the rehabilitation protocols he'd developed. Teaching them to see wild animals not as statistics or data points, but as individual lives worth fighting for. Teaching them that sometimes, when faced with an impossible choice, the right answer was compassion. Behind him, somewhere in the green depths of the jungle, a tigress and her cub moved through their territory. Hunting. Playing. Surviving against odds that should have killed them both. And if that tigress occasionally paused at the edge of clearings, testing the air for the scent of the human who'd saved her life, well, that was between her and the forest. Some debts, Rajesh had learned, transcended species. Some bonds, once forged, never fully broke. The wild had spoken to him in a language older than words, and he'd been changed by what he'd heard.
That was enough. That would always be enough. He drove back toward the ranger station, leaving the clearing behind, but carrying its lessons forward. And somewhere in the rearview mirror, just for a moment, he thought he saw orange stripes moving parallel to the road, a mother teaching her cub the boundaries of their territory, showing a young tiger where the forest ended and the human world began, where danger lived, but also sometimes mercy. The tigress disappeared into the bamboo, and Rajesh smiled. "Good hunting," he whispered to the empty road. "And thank you for showing me what really matters." The forest didn't answer, but then again, it didn't need to. It already had. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comment where you're watching from. Subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy the story. Because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you, and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now, let's get into the story.